Hey everybody! Thank you for coming to the Artios live event, and thank you for coming to Artios. We're excited to partner with you for the upcoming school year. Let me introduce myself real quick. My name is John Lane. I'm one of the directors of the Artios campus in Sugar Hill, Georgia, and there I teach the Worldview classes. And Worldview has always been a big passion of mine, and that's actually what I'm going to be speaking on today. So the title of this workshop is Partnering with Artios for a Biblical Worldview Instruction. And the way I'm going to go about doing that is I'm actually going to talk just real briefly about two of my own personal experiences of how I can remember being taught a biblical worldview throughout various subjects that we had at Artios. But before we can do that, let me start off by we need to define some terms. So what I'm going to do is talk about what is worldview. And I found a really good definition that seems to fit our purpose for this workshop really well. Now, there's all sorts of definitions out there, but the one I really love, especially as it relates to education and teaching kids, is this: your worldview is the world that you think you live in. Now, let me say that again. Your worldview is the world that you think you live in. It's not the world that you live in. It's not reality. It's the world you think you live in. And everybody has their own worldview. Everybody sees the world different ways. Everybody sees situations differently. Okay? Worldviews, our worldview is the world that we think we live in, not the world we actually live in. Now, as a Christian, our goal should be to live in the world that we actually live in. And the only way we can do that is to live in the world and see the world the way Christ and God sees the world. But regardless of whether or not we're doing that, everything is communicating a worldview. Everything communicates a worldview. History, when you look through history, we see different worldviews. When we look at different art, we see different worldviews. Music, theater, everything teaches a different worldview. But as Christians, we have to look at everything through the lens of truth. Okay? We have to look at the world, or look at everything through the lens of truth. And truth is, well, let me talk about this. In the Bible, Jesus is asked a question: why did you come? He's standing before Pilate and and Pilate asks Jesus, why are you here? Why have you come? And Jesus responds with one thing: I came to testify to the truth. Okay? Now, as Christians, we like to think, and this is true, that Christ came to save humanity and to save the world. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, so that whoever believeth in him will have everlasting life. Okay? That's the Bible, that's scriptural. But it's also scriptural that Christ came to testify to the truth. And if Christ came and testified to the truth, as Christians, as followers of Christ, we need to seek after truth. We need to understand and look at the world through the lens of truth. And part of the problem is, as we try and instill a biblical worldview into our kids and into our students, is that we stop short of saying that truth, and God's truth in particular, has a say in every area of life. Okay? One of my favorite authors is Francis Schaeffer. And Francis Schaeffer says this: the biggest threat to Christianity today is the inability for Christians to see the world in totals and instead seeing it as incomplete parts. The biggest threat to Christianity today, and the biggest threat to our students seeing a biblical worldview, is that we segment God's truth and we put it in its own little box apart from everything else. Okay? God's truth is here, it's in my church box, it's in my faith box, but it doesn't relate to my economics, it doesn't relate to my relationships, it doesn't relate to the arts I consume or produce, it doesn't relate to how I understand science or see the world, it doesn't understand mathematics, or it doesn't relate to mathematics, it's in its own little box. As opposed to seeing it, which is the way we should see it, as the foundation for which all of these other things are built on top of. Now, I think the way we try and instill a biblical worldview into our students is this. We have to look for the opportunities to teach students how the Bible relates to every area of life. Okay? How does the Bible and how does God's truth relate to me in every area of life? Okay? It's not just the faith box, it's in every area of life. And the way we do that is we look for opportunities. It's what we call teachable moments. Okay, when we're studying history, we try and we stop when we come into contact with, say, the Reformation, and we don't necessarily keep going in or going on about the dates of the Reformation. We stop and we focus in on what were the truths that came out of the Reformation. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about go through two of my personal experiences that I had in high school that really helped me understand what a biblical worldview is and isn't. And what's funny about this is both of these situations come from the negative. It's not what is a biblical worldview, it's what is not a biblical worldview. And the two examples I have are, they're both art, they're both theater, because I'm a theater guy, and they're both from plays. And one is from a play called Rent, and another is a play called Endgame by Samuel Beckett. So I first saw Rent when I was in college. Okay, I saw it as a movie. I was a theater person. I was in I was at a Christian college studying musical theater. And if you know anything about theater people, whenever a musical comes out in theaters or as a movie, the first thing we do is we put everything aside and we go and we watch that movie. So that's what we did with Rent. It's not the best movie, but I was in college and that's what we did. We went and saw Rent. And Rent is a fantastic work of art. Okay, it's actually based off of an opera called La Boheme. It's not even an original play. It's based off of an opera by Puccini. And the way Rent starts is it kind of follows the bohemian lifestyle in New York. Okay, now there's a difference between Rent and the opera, and the difference is this: in the opera, this bohemian lifestyle isn't glorified, whereas in Rent, it is. Okay, and Rent has this fantastic moment at the end of it. Okay, his main character is kind of suffering through life. She's made lots of bad decisions. She's kind of lived for herself and all of that, and it's starting to catch up with her. And she's sick and she's not doing well. Okay, and in the opera, she's sick and she dies. In the movie Rent, what happens is she kind of dies for like 2 minutes, but then rises again. And there's this amazing anthem coming, anthem music starting to play. And they are all getting together and they're all singing, and they're singing these lyrics. They're singing, "There's only us, there's only this, forget regret or life is yours to miss." Now that sounds like an incredibly appealing worldview. It's, don't worry about the regrets I have. Don't worry about the mistakes I've made. Don't worry about any of that. Because if I do that, if I worry about responsibilities, I worry about regret, or I have regret, or I experience regret, then what I've done is I haven't lived in the moment, and that moment's passed me by. And in the end of life, I don't want to miss it. Remember the lyrics. There's only us. There's only this. Forget regret, or life is yours to miss. And when that is put to this amazing music and this amazing work of art, it's an incredibly appealing worldview. But what we need to do is not, as parents and as teachers, is not just appreciate that as a work of art. And it's a good work of art in its own right. But what we need to do is ask ourselves, okay, what's this actually saying? Okay, when we drill down into this worldview, or into the worldview and lyrics that this is actually saying, what it's saying is this: there's only us, so there's just me. It's just you. There's only this, the here and now. So let's not worry about mistakes. Let's not worry about responsibilities. Let's not worry about the people we've hurt. Let's not worry about any of that, because in the end, you die and then there's nothing. There's only us. There's only this. Forget regret, or life is yours to miss. It's an incredible work of art, but everything communicates a worldview. And as Christians, and as Christian educators and Christian parents, we need to look to our students and ask them, what is this communicating? Is this communicating truth? Is this communicating the truth that Christ came and testified to? Or is this communicating something that stands opposed to truth? Okay. Me in college having seen Rent was a huge teachable moment. And I was able to recognize it as this. Because I'm in college, I've left my parents' house, I'm out in, the world, as much of the world as North Greenville College can be. And I've gone with a bunch of friends, I've seen this worldview, or seen this film, there wasn't a lecture or anything to tell me what this worldview actually was or wasn't. I went into it as a consumer, but because I had been growing up being taught to ask questions and look for the message behind what's actually being presented, I was able to recognize that this is saying something that stands opposed to truth. Now, I saw this in college with a bunch of friends at a Christian school. And a lot of my Christian friends grabbed a hold of that worldview that was presented in Rent, because it was represented in such an appealing way, or it was kind of presented in this neat little box with a bow on top that says, hey, let's live your life for today, because there's only us, there's only this. Forget regret, or life is yours to miss. And what happened is a lot of them took that worldview and they just ran with it. And a lot of them ended up in some pretty, sad places because of it. Now, remember, this wasn't at UGA or Georgia State or anything like that. This wasn't at a place where there were professors antagonistic towards Christianity. This was at a Christian college, a Christian theater program. But works of art and false worldviews were still embraced by my Christian friends because they weren't taught to see the world in totals. They weren't taught to take what Christ and what God is saying in the Bible and apply it to every area of life. This is stuff that seems like common sense, but our kids have to be trained to do this. So when we talk about how do we partner with Artios to instill or teach our kids a biblical worldview, I think the best thing we can do is, as we're studying math, as we're studying science, as we're studying history, literature, theater, art, music, whatever it is to not necessarily focus on the content first and passing the test first, but to pause and teach our kids to view, or teach our kids to look through what the world is telling them and then compare that to what the Bible says. Because everything out there communicates a worldview. And every worldview is either going to stand with truth, or it's going to stand opposed to truth. At Artios, and as a teacher, I want my kids to do well on their tests. I really do. I want my kids and my students that attend Artios of Sugar Hill to leave knowing algebra, science, to have a good understanding of history, to do well on their SATs, and to get into good colleges. But C.S. Lewis has a fantastic quote. And this quote says this: education without values, or education without God, only serves to make man a more clever devil. I can be the best history teacher in the world. I can be the best math teacher in the world. My kids can have the best math and science and history scores out there. But if they don't know how to look through the worldviews and philosophies that are going to bombard them and see how it relates to truth or how it stands opposed to truth, and then how to use the education they've been given to serve God and His kingdom, then the only thing I've done is make man, or make these students, a more clever devil. I've got one more example and this is from high school, and this is when we went and we saw a play, and we took a break after the play to really dive into what was it actually saying. We stopped looking at the artistic value of it and started looking at what's the philosophy this is actually presenting. And this play is called, it's by a guy named Thomas Becket, and it's called, Samuel Beckett, and it's called Endgame. Okay? And this is it's another fantastic work of art. And this is a unique situation because this communicates an awful lot of truth in a lie. And I don't know if that makes sense, but hopefully when I explain it, it will. So Endgame's set up like this. There's these two characters. One's named Ham and one's named Clav. Okay, and one of these characters is disabled. He can't bend his knees. He can't bend any of his joints. And the other character is sick. And the guy who can't bend his joints and all of that, he's the caretaker of the guy who's sick. So it's funny. They both have a problem that they're trying to deal with. Okay? And all throughout this this play, one of the characters is that they're having these great big philosophical conversations and all of that, and then they'll pause and say, "Okay, is it time for my painkillers yet?" And the other character will say, "No, not yet." And then they'll talk. They'll have all these big philosophical conversations and questions and things like that, and then they'll stop again, and they'll say, "Is it time for my painkillers yet?" And the caretaker will say, "No, not yet." And then they'll do this all throughout this play, and it's a long play. And then at the end of the play, what happens is the guy says, "Is it time for my painkillers yet?" And the other character says, "No, there are no painkillers." So what this is communicating, this worldview, or this play Endgame is communicating, is that we're looking forward to something our whole lives. And in the end, it doesn't mean anything. In fact, there's a quote from the play in which one of the characters, Hans, says this. They're having this big philosophical conversation, and they're saying, and Hans says, "Well, we're not beginning to mean something." And Clav responds with, "Mean something? You and I mean something? That's a good one." What they're communicating, what he's saying is this: we don't mean anything. And at the end of this play, the lights go down, and that's how it ends. We don't mean anything. It's probably the most depressing play I've ever seen. It's just a horribly depressing play. But as Christians, we need to look at this and decide, how does this stand with truth? And how does this stand opposed to truth? And this was I remember one of my fellow students in high school asked the question to the director of the play at the end of this. We were able to have a talk back. And one of my fellow students raised their hand and said, "So this play is communicating that there's no meaning to life, right?" To which the director said, "Yes." And then my friend, my fellow student, said this: "How do you justify putting on a play that says there's no purpose to life in a world where so many people are already struggling with self-harm and suicide and things like that. And to my astonishment, the director said, "Oh, well, I haven't thought about that yet." Which really just kind of blew my mind. But as Christians, we came away from that thinking this. This play says there's no meaning to life. But what this play also did is it communicated that, for me as a Christian, looking at this, is a lost person who rejects God has no meaning to life. That's an amazing example of how we can pause and take a second and try and understand what is saying truth and what is standing opposed to truth. Now, I easily could have seen both these plays as part of a theater appreciation credit. But by pausing to take a minute and ask ourselves, and I had teachers and parents that would stop and ask me, what is this actually saying? Taking the time to have that conversation. What is this actually saying? Is this line up with what the Bible says, or does it stand opposed to what the Bible says? By being trained to pause and take a moment and think, is what I'm seeing and what is being communicated to me truth? Or is it something that stands opposed to truth? As parents and as teachers, our whole goal is not that our kids leave Artios knowing math, science, history, literature, any of that. Our whole goal is that they know truth and that they're able to discern what truth is and what stands opposed to truth. And the reason this is our sole, or not our soul, but the reason this is our first priority is because this is the whole reason Christ came. When Pilate asked, "Why have you come?" Jesus responded, "I came to testify to the truth." And then Pilate's response to that question was, "What is truth?" And the whole purpose of education as Christians, the whole purpose of teaching our students, is to show them that answer. Pilate asked the question, what is truth? As Christians, we have the unique ability to actually answer that question. Truth is that our students are made in God's image, that Christ came and died for them, and that they live a life that serves something more than themselves, that serves God. That's our goal in education. And we stop and we take every subject that our students learn and we use that as a vehicle to teach students truth. But the only way we can do that is if we stop and we stop focusing on the test scores, we stop focusing on what college they're going to get into and all of that stuff. And we first focus on, are they understanding truth through this? Because remember, everything communicates a worldview. So everything can be used as a vehicle to teach students whether or not that worldview stands opposed to truth or lines up with truth. At Artios, this is what we do. We're going to keep doing it. And we're going to do more of these parent workshops and things like that throughout the year. And it's our hope that as Artios faculty, as Artios teachers coming alongside parents and partnering with you, that we'll be able to raise up a generation of students that know truth, and that truth will fully prepare them for whatever it is God has in store. I'd love to hear from some of you guys after this workshop, so feel free to send me an email. I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. My email address is jmlane at artiosacademies.com, just like it's spelled on all the t-shirts and the website and all of that. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day, and thank you for listening.